be easier for you guys from down here, up here. I'll introduce you from here and I'll have a seat.
Yeah, we're fine.
Okay.
However you want to do it.
Okay.
I wouldn't worry too much about that.
Oh, and then last question, guys. Do you prefer, some people like to be called last names, some first names?
First names are preferred.
Dan,
Yeah.
Andy, Jeff. Okay.
Right.
All right.
We're pretty good with first names.
Yeah, so- Ian, why do you gotta do that?
Hey, Mike.
Mike?
Mike.
That was my fault.
Blame the president. Oh, thank you. So it should still be good? Okay. And then you don't have a mic if you stand up here.
Okay,
Do you want me to bring you the roving one?
please. Thanks. You guys are a good draw. I should bring you back for all of our topics. So,
Hello.
It's a great
You're Dan? Okay, hi Dan.
You know, and it's funny, I've actually been chasing this work here for 30 years.
oh, really?
There's been so
All right.
many studies done here today. In fact, we had a discussion before we came You're being waved to. Even if we never build anything. Deferred determination.
I know.
All right, welcome everyone. First off, I want to thank you for being here. I'm Ian Friedman. I'm the president of the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association, and I would like to welcome you to this month's Hot Talks. As many of you know, our Hot Talks go each month, the first Tuesday of the month, and we talk about issues, important issues, relevant issues, speakers from kind of across the spectrum to talk about all sides of an issue so that you as the audience are informed. And our structure is we will do kind of a panel discussion here for the first 20 or so minutes, and then we encourage questions from you who are here in attendance, and then those of you who are watching this on the CMBA website and also on Facebook Live. There will be a few things that I kind of business at the end, just for a quick moment, but let's just get started right away. I'd like to introduce you to the panel for what we are discussing this month, and that is the status of our Justice Center and our justice system. The flyer that went out talked about the status of justice here in Cuyahoga County, and it really is intentionally put out that way because I think, as you'll hear, this is bigger than just simply asking ourselves, what do we do with the Justice Center? And so several of us have met with the consultants that were brought in by the county for this project. Becky McMahon, our CEO, Joe Gross, our incoming president, Rose Feeney, our vice president, myself, met with the consultants, and it was a big team, and they'll talk about that in a moment, but including the three gentlemen to my right. And first, I would like to introduce Jeff Applebaum to my immediate right. He is the partner and chairman of Construction Law Group. He is an attorney at Thompson Hine and the managing director of Project Management Consultants. He has advised local leaders on a number of significant projects all around, but in Cleveland, including the Convention Center, the Global Center for Health Innovation, and the Downtown Hilton Hotel. If you look on the site for the steering committee, executive committee, which we'll talk more about, it has Jeff as being involved in this since the very beginning. He has been kind of the called to lead on the study and the advisement of the committee and to take in comment from the public and so forth. He will be heading up the recommendations made to the steering committee in this case. To his right is Andy Couples. He is the principal and national justice sector and civic design leader of DLR Group. He has 30-plus years of experience in the planning and design of justice facilities. This includes both overall system planning and the design of individual court, jail, and prison facilities. To his right is Dan Wylie, the founder and president of Dan L. Wylie and Associates. He also has a great amount of time in this area, 40-plus years in court management and operation planning. Since 1992, he has consulted in areas of judicial facility evaluation and master planning, courthouse space programming, organizational analysis, and operational assessment. When we met with these three gentlemen and their team, there was no question that we were extremely impressed with the experience, the quality of folks that were at that table. The projects that they have worked on, not just across the United States, but beyond and internationally, they really, and for me as a criminal defense lawyer, having gone to so many different courthouses around the country, since then I've spoken to them and am aware of some of the projects that they have, and knowing that that's the quality of work that they have done, I'm very excited to know that, that they are here looking at this as seriously as they are. And I look forward to hearing what they have to say today. So I'm going to open up with Jeff, if you would, just take a couple of moments, and then Andy and Dan as opening remarks. We'll then go into a panel discussion, and then again, I'm going to open it up to the audience for all questions.
Thank you. I'll keep this very brief, 2 minutes or less. Just by way of background, I've been informally involved with this discussion for a number of years. You know, the question was, what do we do about the Justice Center? It was viewed as a building that had, first of all, was falling apart, not in very good shape, deferred maintenance issues, programmatically didn't really work very well, either the jails or any part of it, the courts. So from an informal position, starting in January of 18, that's when my group, Project Management Consultants, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Thompson Hine, that is when we were supposed to have been engaged formally to start managing the process. There was about a year delay. Some of you know about this because there were issues as between the county and primarily the common pleas court judges and others about how do we make decisions? How do we get consensus? It took about a year, actually, for an agreement to be reached that formed a steering committee and a process that we'll talk about a little bit later. So this process really started in earnest in January of 19. My first task, and whenever I do a project like this, the first thing I want to do is get experts involved who actually understand, the best experts in the country who understand the programming process. We went through a competitive process of selecting the best experts in the country on detention and court planning. That led to the selection of the DLR group. Andy leads the DLR group with a group of sub-consultants. Dan is one. We have a few others that are not here. My principal criteria with our leadership was that I still wanted to be the youngest guy in the room, and I still am. But we're very experienced. I'll say it that way. We're very experienced at this. So we hired our programming team. And almost immediately, there was recognition that we had some surprises in store. I will wait to talk about those surprises, and I'll tell you a little bit about what my original thought process was and expectation and what we learned. And I'll just stop right there and turn it over to Andy.
Thanks, Jeff. My name's Andy Couples. I'm pleased to be here, and I'm also pleased to be part of this project because the county has taken the approach that the answer is not about a building. The answer is not about just the courts or just the jail. The answer's about how the system really functions. And the first part of our effort is really focusing on, before we look at what the building is, right-sizing the system. What are we doing? What's driving the system? Who's ending up in jail? What are the court processes? How are the buildings affecting our ability to deliver justice services to the community? Because ultimately, while we talk a lot about efficiency and effectiveness in what we do, we like to think about what the cost of this is in human capital and how we provide better facilities for the folks that we are serving and how we keep people out of jail. And you'll hear today when we talk about this, we're actually looking at numbers which suggest there should be fewer beds than there are today. And as we go through Ian's questions today, we'll touch on some of those issues. Dan?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be part of this team and part of this project as well. For those of you who might not know what programming is, let me just tell you that it's the definition of the kind, size, number, relationship, and operation of all spaces needed to support the staff and functions of the various components that are included. That technical description, that is an important part of this project. We have to come to understand what the spaces are that are needed and how they work. And so to do that, we have a very straightforward, organized, systematic process that leads us from some additional projections of caseloads and jail beds and that sort of thing, and then takes us down to the individual spaces for the various components. One of the early issues is the number of judicial officers that are at work in the system and that may be at work in the system in the future. And so our early discussions here are going to be focused on exactly the kind of litigation spaces that would most effectively serve the courts here and the functions that they have to perform. So we're busy about that. We're looking forward to detailed conversations with all of the components of the system. We'll identify every space needed, the adjacencies, and we'll understand how they work and discuss with them how it should work. It's not just about the way it is now, but how it's likely to be in the future and what sorts of things are impacting the way services are delivered now and should be in the days hereafter.
Thank you, gentlemen. I don't know if this speaker is on. I'll probably hold the other one. This question is for Jeff, and the first question that I have is, we're going to start big, kind of 30,000 foot view. Thank you.
Red button, you turn it off.
This is what happens. All right, there we go. What are the options for the future of the Justice Center?
That's a big question. So let me, and by the way, one thing I do want to make clear on our programming team, Andy heads the overall team. We have detention specialists and we have courts specialists. So Dan leads the courts planning. We have two consultants that aren't here today, Karen Chen, who's a very critical member, and also the Pulitzer Bogart. They are the sub-consultants on detention, and then Andy sort of leads that, and then this is one segment of the overall planning process that I manage. So that's the explanation for that. So what are the options? Well, you can start very large. We have a current building. One thing, the options would be these ultimately. You could attempt to renovate that building in whole or in part. You could create a completely new campus, jail and courts campus on another location, and it would be a connected facility on another location. You could create two campuses. You could create a campus which is just for the jail and sheriff's operations and a courtroom. You could do a hybrid. You could on the current site, you could move the jails to a site and either renovate or complete a new courthouse on that site. So there are a myriad of options. Every option has different advantages and disadvantages. And our job is to go through and talk about all of those options. But it all starts with one fundamental premise. For planning for the next 15, 35 years, even 50 years for a facility, for the jails, we have to understand what is the predicted jail population going to be. What will that jail need to serve? And within the jail, what operations have to occur? For example, for the seriously mentally ill would be an example. So that's one thing we have to know. And then for the courts, what are the number of judicial officers and what are the litigation spaces that we have to plan? So we have all those options and we have those initial planning questions.
Fair enough. Thank you. Now, if I heard you correctly from the opening statements, Jeff, you kind of said the project may have evolved a little bit in looking at the system. If you can elaborate on that and then parlay into this question. You're obviously looking at a room full of lawyers. You know, there's a lot of lawyers watching. We've been talking about this Justice Center for a long time. What is it? Why now is all of a sudden do we have the consulting group here? Why now has change finally been called?
Well, let me answer this a couple ways. If I go back a couple years ago or 3 years ago, the principal concerns that people talked about were the physical buildings. The buildings weren't functioning well, and I would say that the issue was more related to the courts than the jails. The jails were almost an afterthought 3 or 4 years ago. It was about what do we do with our courthouse? Well, a couple things have occurred since then. Number one, there's clearly been a huge focus on what's going on in our jails. Let's face it, issues which have come up, everything from the serial podcast to the tragedies that have occurred in the jails in the last few years. So there's been a tremendous focus on the jails. And as we get into the question of the jails, and now you get into this question of planning for the jails, then you say, okay, what's the jail population? What do we predict it's going to be? Well, one of the things that you have to do at that point is you have to say, okay, what data do we have available right now? Arrest records, all the things you use to predict. And we start to look at, well, what data does the county actually have? How good is that data? And for management right now. And then not only do we talk about who is supposed to be, who's going to be in the jail, we started to take a look at who's in the jail right now. And you start to realize, wait a minute, there are things about these jails. There may be people there right now who shouldn't be there where there's better options. And there may be completely different opportunities that have better human outcomes, because the most expensive thing you can do, if you have someone with serious mental illness, for example, the most expensive thing you can do is to put them in a jail for a lot of reasons that we'll talk about. The most expensive thing to the county and taxpayers, and also with the worst incomes. We get into the same issue about people who shouldn't be there. So what happened as this evolved, we realized, wait a minute, to plan for the future of the jail, we have to figure out what population it should be serving. And then there's the recognition you can't really wait 4 or 5 years, because if there are people in those jails right now who don't belong there and there's better options, and you need to develop your information systems, that has to happen right now. So that is sort of how this all evolved. More focused on the jail than the court. And before you can talk about space planning, you really have to talk about planning to the justice system itself and the things that we haven't done to date.
Fair enough. Thank you. And that kind of works its way to you, Andy, in talking about the jail, because we've all heard horrible stories and tragedy and so forth, and certainly of late. When you got involved in this, how long ago was that you really came to Cleveland and started looking at the center?
I think we started in January, Jeff.
January.
As well. All right. So if you could share with us, not getting down to necessary details, I'm not asking you to point fingers necessarily, but overall, what's not working? Like, what stood out to you? You walked into the jail. Clearly, you heard all the stories. We heard about the deaths and so forth. As an expert in this area, what is it that you saw that just stood out immediately as broken within our jail?
I think the critical issue is simply overcrowding. We have today 2,100 people in a facility that's rated for 1,700 people. We've had numbers higher than that. At the same time, we've had the county's experienced issues with the number of staff that were available, which they are working on now to increase staffing in the jail. The other thing is everybody has a tendency to think of jail as beds and how many cells, how many rooms, what's our capacity. But the jail is a very, very complex organism in how it works. Probably the most critical issue is intake and assessment. In other words, when somebody comes in the door, what do we do to know what their issues are, their problems? And what do we do to look at diversion? Including, for example, we know Cuyahoga County has a lot of specialty courts like the Veterans Courts, immediately identifying that that person is eligible for that. There have been some good things that the county started to do. You know, they renovated a floor for medical and mental health beds. They now have mental health staff directly with the most serious cases. But the key issue is really that assessment up front so we know who we have. And they've been looking now at putting mental health folks right in intake to do an assessment as soon as somebody comes through the door. And as we talk further for the future, the goal of that entire intake and assessment process will be to start to identify people that can be diverted by the jail system. It's not unique to Cuyahoga County that our jails across this country have become the mental health facility of first resort. We need to get somebody off the street, take him to the jail. There's an interesting story from San Antonio, which we're going to go visit because they did a mental health diversion center that's driven by the police, so that a decision's made to take somebody to diversion rather than to the jail. What they found out when they were considering expanding the jail was that a lot of people were coming to jail because a police officer could get in and out of jail in 15 minutes. If they went to a emergency room, they'd be there for 2.5 hours. So the county is even continuing to look at other alternatives to help reduce that population, because with an overcrowded jail, you end up cutting back on recreation time, you end up cutting back on programs, you end up cutting back on visiting. We know right now in the jail it's very difficult for the criminal bar to get to see clients, which is something which has to be addressed for the future. The goal is to divert the people that need to be diverted, and also through what we're doing with planning for the courts and the jail to expedite case processing where we can, where better facilities can support that.
Thanks, Andy. And as a follow-up question to that, whether or not we rebuild the jail there, or we move it, doesn't matter for purposes of this question. Your observations to date, what is working at our jail? What would you take from the jail currently, whether it's a program or structurally, and put into the next evolution of the jail?
Well, I think what they've started to do with putting mental health folks into assessment is something we want to continue. It makes a huge difference in identifying problems before somebody goes to a housing unit and perhaps some unfortunate self-harm event does occur. The city has requested space and intake for pretrial screening. The city has developed a very robust approach to diverting people to pretrial release rather than cash bail or bond.
By city, he's referring to the city municipal courts. As
City
opposed
municipal
to the
courts.
Right.
So the notion of developing an area where we can actually have court services folks making determinations earlier is something we want to continue to process. The jail does operate typically under what's called direct supervision. Many of you are familiar with kind of the things you see on TV of the officer in the glass box and the populations in a day room. Direct supervision says that we're going to put staff in the housing unit with the population so that it's more about direct operation and control of behavior. Right now, that's fairly expensive for the county because the housing units average in jail 1 of 24 beds. Where typically today we're planning 48 to 64 beds in a direct supervision mode. The other part of that will be training staff in interpersonal relationships, because that's really what quality management of the population depends on. Somebody being in there, knowing what's going on, being able to take action when needed. And those are the things that they're starting to work towards even in the existing jail.
Thanks, Andy. Dan, if we wanted to look at a model project for kind of a comparable size and region, where are there any certain complexes that you would recommend, and really what makes them a model? Why would you recommend that we look to those in determining what we do here in Cuyahoga County?
Well, Andy and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. You know, when you work on as many projects as I have, it's hard to pick out one that's really your favorite. They're favorites for different reasons. All right, but the Long Beach Courthouse that Andy was part of, the development and design of, is certainly a exemplary new courthouse. Embodies a lot of the contemporary principles of courthouse design. You know, I have a favorite project that's really old. It's from Arlington, Virginia, many years ago. It's an urban courthouse. Arlington's nowhere near as big as Cuyahoga County. But it was a very, very wonderful, strategic, and functionally efficient facility that I still like to this day. There are other projects around the country. I'd like to just quickly summarize for you some of the key concepts that we like to focus on as we do these kinds of programs. These are generalities, but they all have some specific practical results. Functionality, flexibility, security, economy, dignity, connectivity, and accessibility. Function is not the same exactly as it was 25 years ago. When I was first in juvenile court a very, very long time ago, there was like 3 people in the courtroom. Now there are all sorts of folks that are gathered together in those rooms. The processes are different. The flexibility, whatever the system is today, it's not going to be like this exactly in years to come. And so we have to adapt the spaces to flexible rearrangement as necessary. So I could go through all of these, and I don't want to take up too much time with it. But the 2 most recent ones that I think are so important are connectivity, the introduction of technology as a major operating part of the courts, rather than an add-on. It's not just a computer on a bench, but the whole infrastructure and the operation is built around the technological advances that we have. And accessibility. And by accessibility here, I mean not just in the physical plant itself, but that's very important, but in the whole access to justice concept, where we're bringing services to bear and having services available so that when people come to court, there's ways to connect with the important services that they need.
I'd like to pick up on something that Dan said about safety and security so that everybody's aware. While the Justice Center that everybody thinks about it is Common Pleas and City Municipal Court, we're also including Common Pleas Domestic Relations Court. And that is probably the one area where the issues of safety and security and other things really need a lot of improvement for the future.
They do.
So you're not just deciding the building over here at 1200, you're also looking at the old courthouse as well as part of these
Yes.
questions.
Yes.
That's a mixed issue right now. So right now, there is a commitment as part of the process that the Domestic Relations Court is part of this process. There's not a commitment right now that the Court of Appeals or the Probate Court is a part of this process. So we are looking at the courthouse concept right now includes all the Common Pleas Court. It includes the Municipal Court, Cleveland Municipal Court, Housing Court. It includes Domestic Relations Court, but not the Probate Court right now and not the Court of Appeals right now.
Okay, appreciate it. We're going to open up to questions in a couple of minutes, but I just have a quick question. I mean, obviously, we're early on in all this, but what sort of ballpark price are we looking at here? What's a range that we could be looking at for the various options?
They would vary. There's a lot of variations. There is no option that would not cost several $100 million. Let me put it that way. I mean, we are, but I will tell you, let me give you an example of something, though. Without getting into the absolute number, I will give you an example of how important the jail population is. Because keep in mind, we're not only talking about construction cost, we're talking about operating cost. The operating cost is more significant over time than the construction cost. So let me give you an example of something. Let's take 2 numbers. Let's take a jail, and I'm not even going to talk about the courthouse. Just talk about jails. Let's talk about a jail that was designed for 1,600 people, and let's talk about a jail that's designed for 2,600. So 1,000 difference. Now, You can design your jail to be flexible so it can go up and down. But just those two numbers alone, over the 10-year time frame, the difference in designing those two facilities and operating costs, because your operating cost is going to be something in the order of $40,000+ per year per person. So if I'm designing something for 1,000 people more and anticipate having 1,000 people more in that system, my construction cost is going to be somewhere in the vicinity of $170 million more just for those additional beds. And my operating cost over 10 years is going to be something like $500 million more. These numbers are huge. And over the lifetime, $1 billion. That's why it is so significant to get the population right and to think about what you're designing. Now, by the way, if you do other things, if you have diversion programs, there's also a cost with respect to that, but nowhere near the capital cost, nowhere near the operations cost, not to mention the fact that you have much poorer outcomes if you put the wrong people in jail or don't use diversion programs. Those are the kinds of numbers we're talking about. But overall, you're talking about a number which is going to be north just for construction cost alone. It's going to be north of $500 million, depending on what you do. And it could be a lot north. But it's premature to talk about that with more precision right now.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, so I want to open it up to any questions from the audience at this time, whether you're here in person or watching from your office or home or elsewhere. Frank. We're going to give you, yes, Frank, we're going to get you the mic.
Okay, thank you.
So some of the issues surrounding the population of the prison relates to justice reform. And some of the justice reform issues like central booking and bail reform, are those issues that the steering committee are looking at? And obviously there are serious impediments, one of them being turf wars. Is the steering committee considering how you deal with the various turf wars that are associated with those kinds of issues?
So, I'm going to protect my consultants and answer this question. It is clearly the case that what you do about these issues, and by the way, what we're talking about here are what you've mentioned, bail reform concepts, diversion concepts. It is clear that, as I've talked about, getting those things, fixed or adjusted is critical to our planning. At the last steering committee meeting, we did some polling, and we asked the question as to how you want the steering committee, the 12-person committee, how do you want us to proceed? And we said we can do the following. We can assume that none of these reforms or adjustments are made, business as usual, and we can plan that way. That's one choice. We can assume as a second choice that we can't plan that way. We'll assume these reforms take place and assume that it'll be done by others, and we'll just live with that assumption. Another choice. Another choice was we can assume that these issues will be taken care of, and we can also assume that the 12 members of the steering committee will take charge of getting that done. And by the way, now at that point in time, 11 members of the steering committee were there. One had to leave. And the vote was 10-1 that the steering committee said, assume these things will happen and assume that we will take charge. That's what the steering committee said. Now, beyond that, there's a series of things that can be done, should be done. We think the effort has to be coordinated. Whoever does it, what does not work is having these jurisdictions have to work together to do this. You can't do this in a silo. We think there has to be an organized structure to not only drive these decisions, but also inform us as to the progress being made, because we're going to adjust planning assumptions, not just during this planning stage, ultimately during the design phase. We'll keep making adjustments as we see the numbers change, but we have to know how they're changing.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Frank. Question.
Has the steering committee considered making recommendations regarding, and this is related to Frank's question, changing who controls the jail, who administers the jail and other portions of the Justice Center, which may include changing the political structure itself. Will the steering committee go that far in its recommendations?
Well, and let me say this also on that. It's up to us to put determinations. That would be well beyond the scope. I mean, keep in mind, we are still basically there to talk about a new jail and a new, a new justice center, I should say. We can talk about those things that affect jail population, but certainly we can't get into the bigger political issues, and that's not for us. That's not for, it's not for this group to talk about. It's for someone to talk about, not us.
Thank you. Question?
Thank you. We touched a little bit about it when you used the word campus. Sometimes you talked about the municipal court functions like housing being brought in and all the diversion programs for drugs and mental health and things like that. But those also include aftercare sort of things like bed space in halfway houses and things along those lines. Are those part of the campus attitude as well? And if so, again, I would applaud the idea that the faster you can make a determination about the person's needs, the better off the diversion is going to be. So I would applaud anything to be able to kind of move people along quickly.
So Andy or Dan, you want to take that?
Let me start with that there's two factors that drive the jail populations, admissions and length of stay, and we're trying to look at both of those. In terms of diversion, what we're really looking at that to be, hopefully, ideally, non-jail diversion. That, for example, if we had halfway houses for aftercare, it really wouldn't be part of the jail. It's back in the community. The real essence of diversion is to keep people in the community, because the unfortunate part is, and we see this a lot, for example, when violations of probation are driving the jail population. Somebody's on probation, they have a place to live, they have a job, they're doing okay. They get technically violated and start all over again because you've taken away everything they've been able to build. So when we look at the diversion side of this, however this develops in terms of responsibility with the steering committee, the notion if we did mental health diversion is it's a non-jail issue. It's people that we do instead of arresting and bringing to the jail. That doesn't mean we won't also have a robust SMI program, severe mentally impaired program inside, for folks that are going to be arrested for other reasons. But the diversion alternatives really want to be much, much more community-based rather than jail or institution-based.
I think I'd like to add to that while we're focused on the services that already exist in the current Justice Center, we have recognized in the course of this that there's a tremendous service community out here. A lot of programs in a lot of different areas, a tremendous amount of money, and we're very complimentary for the extent of those services and the way the community has come together to help various populations of folks in need. So we're not suggesting that all of that should be on the same campus, is my point. But the starting point, that initial assessment and sort of charting the initial path through the system can be done and can be included in part of this space. The pretrial evaluations, the mental health evaluations, those things can be done right away and point the direction toward the services that already exist out there.
And one of the issues we know that your criminal bar deals with, a lot of the providers also deal with, which is access to the population. So it's important that when we plan and design for the future that we plan to provide access by volunteer organizations that can actually provide services, as well as, of course, good access for the bar.
Thank you. Question up front?
Is any consideration being given to how a unified municipal court system countywide would fit into the future of the criminal justice system in the county?
There's a lot of thought being given to it. I don't know what our ability to affect that actually is in the circumstance. Jeff can clue me in on the politics, but we think there's some great opportunities for shared services that would arise out of such a thing, in terms of uniformity and bail, in terms of a consistent booking process that gets basically the same treatment and same services available throughout the system. The politics of that unification, I think, are well beyond our scope.
The one comment I'd make, and it's pretty interesting to look at what other states and other places have done. You know, Florida eliminated municipal courts when in 1974.
1972 to 74, all our municipal courts went away.
You have many, many other justice systems where you have a separate criminal and civil court system. Those things, by the way, could make for much more efficient court systems and courtrooms. We can't control that, and we can't assume any of that, and that's for someone else to talk about someday. It would have a tremendous impact. It's just that our Justice Center is falling apart while we are waiting to see if anyone might do something. So we just can't assume that. Another constraint that we have right now is, we can't, you can have arguments about the number of judicial officers, the number of common pleas court judges. We can't, we don't have any control over that. We can't talk about that. That's set by state legislature with, the comment from the Supreme Court. So there's a lot of things that are simply assumptions that, in some magical world, yeah, we would change this, this, and this, but we have to work within the constraints that we have.
I guess that gets to a question that I have. When you talk about the constraints, I was going to ask each of you, what obstacles, are there any obstacles that are preventing you from putting into play what you think is the ideal project?
Don't look at me. You start.
Well,
I'll clean up on this one depending on what you say.
I'll answer first, and I'm going to answer in a generality, but I think everyone will understand what I mean, and that's inertia. The tendency of a body to keep doing exactly what it's doing and nothing else. And so our efforts, as much as we can, are aimed at sort of teasing out a perspective that says, you know what, maybe we could do this better. And we do it in sometimes subtle ways. When we go in to do programming interviews, we say, now, don't talk to me about what you already have. I want to talk about what the services you're delivering, and tell me, if you could have the spaces you think you would really need, what would they be? Try to break away from the existing mold. Well, that needs to be done in operations too. And so sometimes you can't just hit that in the face, but we do encourage the courts and the various services to consider how things are changing and how they might change for the better, and exactly how they might be changed in the short term that would affect the long-term reality.
Thanks, Dan. Andy?
I would suggest, because what the phase we're in really is still the system planning issue, and the next steering committee meeting, they'll be asked to make determinations on what the path forward is and the basis for planning. There has been a lot of efforts, as a gentleman asked the question, already put forth to look at bail reform, to look at pretrial diversion, to look at other kinds of things. There's studies upon studies that have been done, but we're still where we're at today. And I think the most critical issue to being able to move off of dead centers on these issues is to find champions for them that are actually going to step up and help drive decision making and help run the traps whenever we have turf wars and decisions about my responsibility versus your responsibility. At our last steering committee meeting, whenever we presented a whole range of what we call population management initiatives, the clear bottom line is it can be done, but there's no one single agency responsible for everything. We can't say it is the common pleas court, or it is the municipal court, or it is the jail. It's a systemic issue, and it takes systemic coordination with a champion to drive it, to really make change happen. Because the last thing we want to do is, what I talk to my clients about is, you really have two choices today. You can simply institutionalize the past in a new building, or you can have a vision for the future. And we're trying to get to that point to where we have a shared vision for what the future not only could be, but will be.
So I would say, and I have 3 words written down. One of them is inertia. The second one is turf, and the fact that all of our systems are so cannibalized. I mean, we have so little unification that they have to be really, we have to bring this together, resources, money. Now here's the silver lining. The worst thing that could have possibly happened in those jails are the deaths that occurred. The best thing that, or the silver lining of that, would be finally getting the inertia, getting that change where people understand the urgency of this. And by the way, don't kid yourself. The system taken as a whole, it's the physical. It is the physical facility. It is the systems. It is the processes that all go together that can change all that. So that's the opportunity.
And just picking up on what Jeff said about resources, this is why we think the determinations by the steering committee at the next meeting are so important. The difference between building a 1,600-bed jail and saying we are going to change, and building a 2,600-bed jail, given the criticality of the problems that jails are facing, may determine if there's money available for anything to address courts issues. Because there's only so much resources any government entity can commit.
Yeah, and when you go to some other jurisdictions, and by the way, this is no different. I go around the country and doing stadium and arena projects, so I work in a lot of different jurisdictions. And one thing that happens in this jurisdiction is because of history, we have a lot of different political units. We have a lot of different municipalities. What do we have? 59 municipalities or something like that are all in the county. By the way, 26 of which don't report crime data. I mean, just the idea of getting data or getting information, figuring out what's going on, getting a unified system. If you're going to do bail reform and figuring out how to do it uniformly, all of that is very, very difficult. Because historically, Cuyahoga County was a place of many, many municipalities, many, many jurisdictions, many, many different courts, and that just, that's a fact. And to getting that unified and coordinated has to happen for a justice system.
Thank you, guys. Question, Frank.
Who chose the members of the steering committee, and do you believe you have all of the appropriate stakeholders?
So what happened, I will tell you what happened with this. Originally, when we were going to do this project, and I'm talking about PMC, we said that we absolutely have to have a stakeholder process. But we have to have everybody at the table, and we have to identify the critical stakeholders. And that was recognized. I mean, and the judges in particular and others recognized it. But the issue then was, we need to make this formal. It wasn't enough for certain people to do this in a informal fashion, so it had to be formalized. This led to a long conversation about the steering committee and who would be the decision makers. There were discussions and negotiations primarily. The primary parties in that were the county executive, the Common Pleas Court led by Judge Russo, and there were a series of negotiations back and forth. There were listings provided as to who should be on that steering committee. That was negotiated among those players. Others were then contacted, including those who serve on the steering committee. And an agreement was reached as to 12 members of the steering committee. That was formalized in a memorandum of understanding, which is what we have right now.
Good. Next question.
Hi. Obviously, we've got a number of people here and many watching remotely as well. a lot of the focus we've talked about today is kind of on the criminal justice system. So the jail obviously is a large part of this project. But for the members of the Bar Association and the public who don't really have any interaction in the day-to-day in the criminal justice system, what aspects of the civil process and the litigation, whether it's mediation, whether it's simply efficiency within the court because of criminal problems, so what would you say to the folks that are kind of looking at this and how this affects their day-to-day based on the civil component? Dan.
Well, I'll take a shot at it. The civil is one of those things that frequently takes a sort of a back seat to the criminal process with all of its timelines and that sort of thing. We understand that there have been initiatives in the past to do, is it a business court? It's a sort of a high-end specialty court for certain kinds of business litigation. It's been on again, it's been off again, and we would certainly favor something, a renewed initiative in that. Your system, unfortunately, doesn't allow for the creation of a separate civil division. That's an organizational issue that's taken place at the state level. The divisions of court are Common Pleas General Division, the Domestic Relations Division, and the Juvenile and Family Division, and Probate Division. The creation, and then there's this individual docket thing that requires every judge to get some of every kind of case, and all of them to be handled completely by the judge who has them. So it's difficult to set up special dockets. It's certainly difficult to create a special civil division. We believe that in jurisdictions where they have such a split, it's been easier to work out efficient processes and to expedite civil cases more effectively through the system where they're not competing with the criminal procedures. Now, are we actively working to that? We don't think so because we think your state organization precludes it at the moment. But if that were to change, we think there are efficiencies and good things that could occur.
From a planning and design perspective, as we move into programming, though, specifically, we look at Common Pleas Court, we're typically looking at jury courtrooms for all of them, but with full technology for evidence presentation and other kinds of things, which are extremely important in the civil bar. Courtrooms will come with attorney-client witness rooms, places to sit and talk. Dan is now moving into discussions about, in addition to courtrooms, settlement rooms, mediation rooms, other things that should be in the courthouse and be available to help in the resolution of cases. And probably one of the most critical issues we are looking at that's on the non-criminal side is a domestic relations court, because you basically have the magistrates doing their hearings in very small offices with only one way in and one way out. There are some real safety and security concerns for domestic relations, but also looking at right-sizing what a courtroom needs to be for the function. So we're going to be going through a whole range of analysis that will affect both civil as well as criminal.
We're conducting a series of workshops, one related to litigation spaces with each of the courts. We just worked with domestic relations yesterday, and next day or so, I'm trying to remember the schedule exactly, with Municipal Court, with the Housing Court on Friday, and then with Common Pleas General Division on Monday. And each one of these is focused on what works, what doesn't work about the litigation spaces you have, what needs to be addressed, what doesn't need to be addressed, what are the capacity requirements really? Are there any unique characteristics that might associate themselves with the treatment courtrooms as opposed to any other courtroom? The system as it stands is essentially one size fits all in the main courthouse there. But we're hoping to promote some degree of variation that will allow the spaces to more suitably and effectively deal with the functions that will be held there.
Very good. Thank you. So we've got now just a few more minutes. Are there any other questions from the audience at this point?
Yeah, actually, I had just had one quick question, which is about data collection. Thank you for being here. You've been talking a lot about the critical importance of some of these assumptions that have to be made and some of these decisions, whether it's jail population, whether it's pretrial services and how many people are going to be coming through sort of the initial phase and assessment, et cetera. Dan and Andy, specific to you, what is your experience about how Cuyahoga County's collection of data compares to other jurisdictions when you have been working? Are we doing well in gathering information that we're able to turn over to you compared to others, or do you see a different experience?
Let me preface that by saying everybody we've talked to has done their best. The systems do not really provide the kind of information that we needed. We were forced in a lot of areas to do even hand review of data. For example, we tried to get very good information on what's the profile of the population, what bond amount are they sitting in jail with, do they have any other holds? Because that becomes a key indicator of what you can do to manage the population. That was virtually unavailable. As Jeff pointed out, we were looking to get crime data from all the jurisdictions. Not all jurisdictions report or report uniformly. And I think the one thing that we know is crime is down, arrests are down, everything's down, but you really need the data to prove that. And when we talk about our population management initiatives, there needs to be an understanding of what are the key indicators that should be looked at. Pretrial length of stay, for example, the ability to really look at pretrial and pre-sentence. Because many times, even after a trial, there's a delay before somebody actually has a pre-sentence investigation, is finally sentenced. The county has initiated a new jail information system, but the ability eventually to tie jail information to court data to really have a robust management structure is something that we've suggested the steering committee should look at.
By the way, and it just occurred to me that I used the wrong word a few minutes ago. I said cannibalized. I meant to say balkanized. We have a very balkanized system where everything is split up. That was a very polite answer. Our grades from our consultants, looking at our systems here versus other places, we did not do very well. There are many, many, many other jurisdictions that are far ahead of us in terms of what they have implemented for data collection and evaluation. And once again, I think it is because we are such a balkanized system where everything is in pieces and parts.
And I would just add one word to that, Jeff, and that's integrated systems. We can, because of the balkanization, you may do pretty well in getting some critical data, but when it relates to the other data, you can't cross-reference it. It's tough. So we've had pretty good luck with some of the basic data in the court systems with filings and trends like that. But your state system, for example, only requires the reporting of criminal cases in common pleas as a unity. So our ability to distinguish among the trends within the criminal calendar overall, what's happening to serious crime, to murders, for example, or something else, we can't really do that very effectively.
All right, so in the last 3 minutes here, very quick questions. Jeff, what is the ETA on this? When should we expect some results?
This process, and we'll come back about the steering committee, this process, the planning process, we should know most of our information by the year end in the beginning, but it formally will conclude in the April timeframe, and we'll be ready to make all recommendations should be final, then we move on to the next step.
Now, you're just making recommendations. What happens with your recommendations? That's at another level.
So here's the process. We make recommendations, and they go to the steering committee. The steering committee makes determinations. Those determinations under the MOU, there must be, while there are 12 members of the steering committee, there must be a supermajority. 10 of 12 must vote positively for every recommendation or every determination. And you'd say, my God, that means that 3 people can block this process. Yes, which is what, and by the way, that's the value of this. it forces consensus building in a public setting. And actually, we don't mind that. We think this has to be done. We have to drive a consensus, but it does take 10 or 12, and that's for every major determination that's going to be made.
And it has to be transparent.
And it's completely transparent because it's all done in a public setting.
Fair enough. And lastly, every year that passes, what additional costs would be incurred? Because when we met, I think you had used a construction cost that, to me, I found staggering. So perhaps you want to share that.
I'll share that with you. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that we end up, and by the way, this is an assumption. Assume it's $700 million of capital cost. Right now, and who knows where, what's predicted for inflation, but right now in the construction industry, we are using numbers at around 6% per annum. So if it's $700 million, every year we put it off, it makes it $42 million more expensive. And keep in mind, we keep putting Band-Aids on the building. So we're repairing windows, if it was a new building, where we would either renovate or build new. So we're doing fixes every month, hundreds of thousands of dollars that we'd probably replace anyway. So it is millions of dollars a month. Every month we don't do something that is adding to the overall cost.
I think it is that time, unless we have one other time for one quick question. Good? Yeah, I'm going to talk about that.
Great, thank you. One issue that I don't think we spent much on was the impact on the community and their involvement in some of these sort of important decisions. And related to that, though, the community went through it most recently with the juvenile justice system, and I wonder if there are any lessons from that process where they consolidated magistrates and judges. They consolidated, juvenile adjudication, the prison facility, as well as custody determinations. So, are there lessons there?
There's tons of lessons. We can't get into them in a minute left, but here's what I would tell you. Each one of these meetings, so what we have is we have public steering committee meetings. Now, these are supported by working group meetings, but there are a series of steering committee meetings. These are public meetings. These have public comment. So you do have a voice. The public has a voice. These meetings are advertised. The agenda is put out in advance. But there's reach out in all these working groups. But there's a ton of lessons to be learned. But with 30 seconds left, I don't think I can start on that.
The next meeting is Tuesday, September 17th. It is at 9 a.m. Everyone here is not only invited but encouraged to attend. It is at the Global Center for Health Innovation in room 313. So again, the Global Center for Health Innovation, room 313, 9 a.m. on Tuesday, September 17th. I would also, on your tables, you will see pieces of paper there. Green is for those of you who are here from the business community, blue from the legal community. If you would please take a moment to read those. They deal with the CMBA's request to become a 13th member of the steering committee. We would ask that if you are in agreement with the language therein, that you sign that, identify your title, position, the firm and organization you're with, and date that. As we started off, I think Becky had said there will be a follow-up meeting. That will be October 8th. That will be the kind of next hot talk on this issue of the Justice Center. That will be here at noon. And I misspoke at the start. I said that it's the first Tuesday of each month. I was sitting here doing my math, and with the date being what it is today, it's of course not correct, and it's the second Tuesday of each month. I would like to thank Jeff Applebaum, Andy Couples, and Dan Wylie for their willingness to be here today, for their efforts on behalf of Cuyahoga County Justice. We appreciate you being here today to let us know what's going on in our county. Thank you.